Back, everybody. Hopefully, everybody had a good discussion in their breakout room. We're going to have Margaret. Margaret Clark's going to talk to us. She's a associate professor, assistant professor. It's assistant professor of couple and family therapy at Briercrest Seminary. Probably some of you met her at the recent Common Table gathering that we had around the wildfires in Los Angeles while we were there. She's going to present some information to us about what we think we know about pastor spouses, what causes the struggles, what causes them to flourish, just what we think we know. So I'm going to pass it off to Margaret and let you tell us what we need to know, Margaret.
Thank you, Richard. Lovely to be with you and see many faces I know and meet some new ones. I am thankful for the opportunity to present this. So I am going to start first with a literature review. So at Common Table in January, there was a chance to do what's called Design Labs, and this was a stimulus to get us talking about pastors' wives. I am going to caveat that in a second, just so you guys know what's up with the literature there. So we're going to look at a bit of what the literature says, and then I have actually just submitted an article for review on some new data on this, and so I'm going to share a little bit of the findings at the end about that as well. So when it comes to the literature on clergy spouses, I would love to speak to you robustly about all this wonderful literature that's out there and that it's really diverse. Unfortunately, it's not. Okay, there is very little literature, especially peer-reviewed published literature. There is some more in what we would call the gray literature space, good quality things, and even things like memoirs that unfortunately aren't really captured in peer-reviewed literature. But there is limited on clergy spouses. What is out there is primarily heterosexual clergy wives. And so the literature really speaks to that. There definitely is a lack overall. And certainly if we start speaking about some of the other spaces, there's not much to know about husbands, right? Heterosexual husbands of that. There's not much to know about same-sex couples when it comes to that. So please just be aware. So I'm probably going to transition to talk about clergy wives, not because the other spouses don't matter, but it really is in that space that we can look to the literature. So in this, what we do have would say they are understudied and they have unmet needs. And so hopefully maybe even today, this is going to prompt some of you maybe to further investigation in this area. So we're going to look at what of the literature that we have. And again, of course, we see what we see. And so there is, we embrace it and also know that it's only a partial picture. And there's much more that we could know. So key themes, we're going to look at role in ministry. We're going to look at the unique stressors and expectations that clergy wives encounter. And then what is this group of people, this demographic is amazingly resilient, and how is that? And so we're going to look at what are the resources that they point to for their well-being and resilience and talk about that. So I'm going to go way into the way back. 50 years ago, there was a seminal study by Taylor and Hartley, 1975, and this is where they defined ministry as what is called a two-person career. Now, this wasn't unique. This was common back in the day. So business executives, maybe politicians, and it's a career where the wife is expected to contribute informally. Again, it's specifically husband-wife situation, but the wife is expected to contribute for the person to be successful. And so this is a piece of one of those kind of early concepts that was looked at and considered this two-person career. Now, as we move forward, we do see that, many wives and the study that I've just was working on, there is a really sense of calling. And some of that might just be like a joint calling. Some of it might be a calling to the wife, the ministry wife role as a unique calling in that. The role, I love to say, one of the things, again, I'm a professor, I'm a therapist, I'm a researcher. I'm also a pastor's wife. So one of the things to know about me, my husband was in local church ministry for 25 years. He's now in a denominational role. I like to say it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. It is a highly complex space. And so I think this idea of it's not either or, it's both and. And so it brings beauty and purpose, and it brings challenges, and the literature reveals that. And so sometimes you might see literature that speaks to the challenges because that was the focus. Other times you might see it speak to all the benefits and the beauty or the resilience because that's what it was looking at. But it is really both and. So one of the challenges more recently, so moving from kind of two-person career, another term that I think is really relevant for clergy wives is what they call the third shift. We know we hear second shift a lot when it comes to women in general and careers, and that's the idea that in addition to the career, they bear more of the burden at home. When we talk about clergy wives, we see what we call the third shift. So might have career work, bear primary responsibility for the family and home, and then they also have ministry responsibilities, hence the third shift. And that is part of the experience and a term that Blanton and Morris talked about and has been talked about further. So how do couples navigate this? So again, we're really looking at a systemic issue because we're talking about the couple system. And so Cathics model, they really looked at how do people navigate this and came up with these ideas of three approaches. So living sacrifice, this is where it's like ministry over family. Faithful spouse and parent, family over ministry, or what they call the peacemaker model, where they're trying to balance both. And that is one of the things that I think is helpful to kind of think about how are couples navigating this aspect of that. The interesting thing with this, the wives' approach to this was highly influenced by the husband's view and also the congregation's view. It wasn't just within the couple, it was part of that. So that how they approached the model and what their kind of position was, and it was highly influenced by those two factors. So when we think about clergy wives, and again, there's interesting pieces. Again, there's this very traditional, we can think of sort of the traditional role in contributing to church. And so this is things like music, education, specifically kids ministry or women's ministries. Lay speaking is quite common. Leadership roles are quite common for clergy wives. The Deshawn, so again, this isn't published, but again, Richard, you might even, if you had the link to the task analysis piece where it's posted, if somebody has that, that would be great if we could post that. A really great piece of research that did a task analysis, job analysis piece on clergy wives. And the article that I published on was not that part, but some of the qualitative responses that came with that study. And so that really looks at some of the nitty gritty of like, what are these women actually doing in the ministries out there? And a very fascinating thing. So if you're curious about that, it's really interesting to look at. And so again, there's a lot that's being contributed. Again, this is primarily unpaid work. Of course, there are co-pastors or the situations where the wife is also in a paid position, but lots of it is in this volunteer position. And this is where one of the pieces, Ledbetter did this really great dissertation, and she really identified, I liked a term that she used. She talked about no choice volunteers. Was a really interesting way to consider that, right? So we've got two-person careers, we've got third shift, we've got no choice volunteers. You're starting to see some of the maybe the not so pretty side of what it means to be a clergy wife. But one of the pieces that she did recognize, again, these people are contributing significantly in the churches, but there is also a desire for more recognition with that. And so a piece of that was identified as well. So expectations, they come from congregations, they come from the husbands, and they come from themselves. And so one of the pieces when it comes to specifically the husband, there is this dynamic that happens, far more to go than we have time to go into here, but this dynamic of the wife is really the key support to the husband. This is the confidant, the person that they bounce everything off of, the person that they bring all their stress to. And that's a central part of that. There can also be all types of things, such as, again, having to present, like have the perfect marriage, have the perfect home, have the perfect faith, all of these things that can come and be kind of mediated through the husband. In those spaces. And so these stressors, the stressors that they experience, again, lots of internal stress, that piece of expectation that comes, lots of lifestyle stress. Again, some of you work in denominations where people are moved. And they move fairly frequently. The stress of that, interestingly enough, falls primarily, the stress of the move falls primarily to the clergy wife. They don't have the same, like, oh, I got to go to work and go have all that new exciting. They're the one who's having to do the uproot, help establish the family, help reestablish their own work. And so a lot of stress that way that comes with it. Parsonage living, for those who experience that, lots of that piece as well. And then the relational piece is quite interesting. Again, the experience of criticism that goes alongside congregational expectations can be quite intense, and not just criticism, say, of their own person. It can be criticism of their kids. They hear the criticism of their spouse as well. When people are upset, they often don't talk to the pastor, they might talk to the spouse. And so that's another stress. And so this experience of being married to somebody in a demanding and high profile role is a significant aspect of the clergy wife's experience. And there is this expectation, if we all sat down and thought about it, like, what is the ideal pastor's wife, right? What is our picture in our mind of this like person? It is this, in often cases, is this very selfless person who puts all their time and energy into caring for others. And so that becomes part of that experience for them. So congregational expectations. Again, often the minimum is stated, right? So again, lots of, especially in this day and age, lots of clergy couples are aware of this dynamic. And so, if it's their choice in interviewing, they might ask about this. And often the really great answer is, oh, we just expect them to be like any committed church member, right? And that's just like, that's all we expect. They can be and then that could be true in some churches, but often there's a lot of unspoken expectations and demands that congregants, churches, boards, etc., might not even have in their awareness, and they're just this subtle piece. And again, it can definitely come through congregations. And then there's, of course, the husband's expectations and the own internal expectations of self. And so these, depending on the context, these expectations conclude everything from appropriate behavior, attire, attendance, ministry leadership. Again, it gets into that sort of two-person career. Sometimes it's expected, you are a couple, we've hired you both, even though that's not formalized in that. One of the things that we do know from so the research is that there are higher expectations for clergy, their families, the spouses, than there is for typical congregants. So there's sort of a two-layered standard of, oh, it's okay for us to, be this and that and be messy, but it's not okay for the pastor and his wife and family to be otherwise. And so these expectations are negative and intrusive. Fishbowl is a common experience for people in ministry. And it is that sort of intensive sense of the eye, the gaze always on you. There is no space. There is no privacy, depending on the context. In some of my other research I did on clergy resilience, I remember people being like they know my car. They lived in a small rural or remote community. They're like, it doesn't matter where I am, they find me. Like, they know everything about me. I can be doing whatever, day off, whatever, they will find me. And so it is this piece of, can be very intrusive and negative when the demands are kind of there, and especially the unspoken ones. So it isn't just others' expectations. This is also very much an internalized piece and challenge with that. One of the interesting things to look at is this, again, this piece of many pastors' wives, clergy wives also work. Again, some would look at that as work, right? They're there to have a dual income. It might not be something they feel particularly called or passionate about. Others, of course, have a career and have a strong sense of this is my own sense of vocation. There is definitely some literature that talks about the need to support the family. So there's some research about higher dual income clergy families than the norm. I don't know if that's still true. Again, it's over 10 years old when that was done. But at that point, because clergy incomes tended to be lower, the need to supplement that by the spouse working wasn't just like, oh, I feel like doing this. This was a requirement. And so everything from, and again, this bears out in the article I just wrote. I need to supplement the income. I need to supplement healthcare, and I need to supplement retirement. It was something that felt very strongly about. Many people, again, that may not be desired. They may not want to do that. Other people do. The one comment stands out from a clergy wife that they felt called to do that. Like, I am called to work to support my spouse in their ministry, and that was a really interesting statement. Now, work has some benefits. It definitely offers some of the autonomy. So the enmeshment of clergy wives into the husband's work and ministry is unique as a career. So having your own work offers autonomy and purpose, but when we think about third shift, it offers the extra pressure from how to balance work, all the home life, and ministry life becomes a lot. Couple of significant stressors, and this one especially, I've spoken a bit about the ministry overlap. Again, this overlap between work and family life is very unique as far as a parental career. That's unusual. And it also is the family often has to take the back seat to the ministry. But loneliness, I think, is one of the most profound and important things, I think, to keep in mind for clergy wives, is there is limited social support. And it becomes difficult for clergy spouses to find supports. And there is definitely a guardedness within the ministry context. So there's a couple different studies that found that clergy wives are actually more isolated than the husbands. They have less supports. And again, of course, transitions, uproot supports. Being too busy means you don't invest in the other supports that you do have. And so it all kind of combines to have a real aspect of loneliness in that. So you might hear all that bad news and go, why would anyone do this? Like, run for your life. But this is also the part that we have to endorse and recognize it is also something that these people find so beautiful and rewarding. And so that's the part that is important to recognize. We can't just sort of favor one and ignore the other. It's both and. So rewarding but stressful, and that's important to note. Coping strategies. So again, a variety of things. Again, I'm going to share from the article I just submitted some amazing resources that people are relying on. Connecting with friends outside the congregation becomes a big one. Protecting personal time. And this just becomes, again, being a bit guardians, like kind of going, we're putting drapes up on the fishbowl. We're not just going to live in the fishbowl. And again, there is an intense reward found in helping others grow. And so that's one of the things that kind of comes back, is that the beauty of seeing sort of that inside view of spiritual growth is so meaningful for this population. So when we think about that, how are people thriving? And so again, the social support is crucial in that. Protective factors, again, the interesting thing, loneliness rates are high, but the reliance on the relationship with God and that space is really important for clergy wives. The sense of affirmation of the husband's ministry call is definitely a dynamic of it too. Healthy lifestyles, all of those kind of things. Boundaries. We're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit more when I get into my study, and the recommendations arising from that becomes important as well. Some of the recommendations made by the other literature. I love this one. Again, I'm owed a lot of back pay. Pay clergy wives for 10 to 33 hours of work a weekly. This was Hartley, 1978. So again, they were connected to the two-person career. They basically said, and specifically they were talking to congregations and denominations, like, these people contribute a ton to ministry. Like, you should pay them if you want them to continue to contribute. We're 25 years or 50 years later, that hasn't happened. Although we do see maybe more employment of clergy wives in the congregations. I don't know, that'd be an interesting study. Other recommendations made: provide clergy education and denominational support. The weird space, and I know some of you here today were with denominations, and you're like, how do we support these people? It's even a challenge to research these people because it's not a formal role. They're not employed. Like, how do we even contact them? Richard could talk about that. He has been on a mission, and it's a hard thing to even figure that out. But how do we think about this and provide support when it is informal? Mentorship, training, and rest to clergy wives, right? These are some of the spaces that can be helped. Encourage more family time for clergy. And again, this is for congregations. Denominations then have a role in helping to support congregations to actually live into that. And develop relational support systems for clergy spouses with privacy and safety. Again, part of my primary work, I still do have a small private practice as a therapist, and I focus specifically on clergy and spouses. And that's really important. Safe spaces, professionally, like therapy, also personally, where it's not going to come back and have implications for one's ministry, becomes really, really important. So we're going to take a break. I think Richard maybe is going to send you back into breakout rooms for some more discussion, and then we'll come back and I'm going to share a little bit about the new study.
All right. Well, am I live again? Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Yeah, we're gonna, after having heard what Margaret said, great stuff, Margaret. I've got a lot of questions that we'll come back and address when we get going. But before you go into your breakout session, there's one question that you should ask each other and answer for each other: is what stands out to you so far about this presentation? So it's a simple question. What stands out so far? What are the points that you've taken out of it that you want to explore a little bit more? And with that, we'll go to the rooms and have a discussion. So we had a little bit of a chance to talk about what Margaret said. Now we're going to have some time to talk among ourselves and talk a little bit about what we think we know. We're going to have some questions and answers. Margaret, I got a question for you. One of the things that we had in our first group, Erin's a female pastor that's on the call with us, and her husband is too, Leon.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things she said when she was at the Common Table gathering in LA, Rick made the comment that the rates of depression among pastors and is higher than the general population, and pastor spouses even higher. I don't know where that statistic came from, but I'm curious if you do.
Yeah, I would have to track that down offhand. I'm not really good at retaining those kind of information. The interesting thing, though, the one with the loneliness thing, though, there's two different studies that use this loneliness scale, both higher than divorced people, which again have higher loneliness ratings anyways. Pastors' wives had higher. The depression rates in one of those was lower. So it was an interesting thing of like, how do we make sense of this? Because we might assume certain things go together. So in that, again, I'm not sure if, well, any research, right? It's for that sample. And I think there's always caution in taking it and extending it to like all pastors' wives are depressed. I think when we get enough things that kind of reinforce, we can start to go, oh, this might be true in this population. So I don't have it offhand, Richard. So
okay, well, somebody just posted in the chat that it's Ray Jean's stuff.
Okay, there you go.
Study.
Yeah,
so that makes sense. That's good data to know.
Totally.
It's dated now, but I suspect it probably hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Let's open it up for questions from other folks.
Do we have time for me to just share a couple slides on the new article? Do we have time for that, Richard? Okay.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Then we can get
okay. Well, let me do that really quick. So so this is a new study. So I've just put this, it's under review. Let's hope that it might get published. This is a study, and again, it was using some archival data, doing some thematic analysis on, it was a survey and they had open-ended questions. So that's what I worked with, 549 clergy wives. Originally collected October 2021 to 2022, so fairly recent. And some of the themes that were interesting that came out of this. So again, that piece that Richard linked with Rick Deshawn's job analysis, that was the survey was asking about this, and these were open-ended questions that then the respondents can answer. A couple of the interesting categories that I think stands out to me that isn't spoken out about a lot was around clergy wives' sense of calling. And this is something, surprisingly, we know this is really important for clergy, and yet we don't know as much about how important this is for clergy wives. And it was really interesting to kind of see the themes of how do clergy wives understand their calling. And one of the ones that was really interesting, now this was a more conservative sample, heterosexual, predominantly white, predominantly Baptist, and 20 plus years in ministry, 50 plus years was the dominant age. But one of their really sense of calling was supporting their husband in his ministry. That was a lot of people's view of their calling, and they expressed it in those ways. And so in that way, it wasn't necessarily about the church. It actually was, I support my husband, his job is the church. Okay. And one person said, I'm the clergy wife, not the church wife. I was like, oh yeah, snap. That's a good saying, man. But that was it was really clear. That is my calling, is to support my husband. Alongside of that, often intermingled, but was also the sense of my calling, and then is to manage children and home. I release my husband in many ways to do that. And that's one of the ways I do that. Others had very much a partnership or joint calling, even if sometimes that meant both were employed, but lots of times it just meant like, we're a team, we're both called. He might be the one getting paid, but this is a partnership. There was that. Others talked about individual calling. Some of that might be in the church, right? I would serve in this leadership capacity regardless. Others, it was, I'm called to be a therapist, or I'm called to be a teacher. So one of the things I think that's really important is there is huge diversity, right? So again, this was a kind of a homogeneous like sample, and there's still diversity. And so I think when we think broadly, I don't think we can kind of bulk or generalize a clergy spouse or a clergy wife. There are diversity, and I think that's one of the key things that we need to understand is, how does this person understand this piece, and then for the couples to talk about that. Another really interesting thing, because this was doing this job analysis, they had the chance to speak to kind of what do they do. One of the most interesting thing, which does fit with other research, is this whole idea of filling needs. And it was basically like, what is it these clergy wives are doing? And lots of it was just, I see a need because I'm connected to the pastor. I want him to be successful. I fill the need. And there was another study, I'm forgetting the name, that looked at that they did a study of like seminary, like clergy spouses when they're in seminary and then when they're in the role. And despite their intentions, they all ended up doing the same thing. And that was basically this essence of, we see the need, so we fill the need. And so I think that's a really interesting piece, again, of how might clergy wives be prepared, how might clergy couples be prepared for that, compared to, again, other people looked at it very much like, I am an involved, committed member. I use my gifts as God just directs me. And so that's another way people were doing that. Some of the challenges very similar that were talked about, really reinforced some of the earlier literature. And supports, again, the spiritual piece is so profound for clergy wives. And then specifically the boundaries. And they have some great piece of like, and boundaries for self, but also like, I keep my husband on track. Like I'm his kind of boundary keeper with the church, with himself. And so that was interesting as well. And then some of the other ones that were talked about. So I had some recommendations arising from that. And so one of them would be, I think it's really important for the spouse's personal sense of calling that they clarify that. and they clarify that together. So where is that congruent, incongruent? What are the expectations? And then begin to define together what do boundaries for personal and ministry life look like. Training, support to enact those boundaries. I think that's one of the key things that spouses need training is like, how do you have boundaries? What does it look like to put drapes on the fishbowl? Just acknowledging that there are diverse ways, right? Just because the last spouse at the church did this does not mean that the next spouse is going to do that. And it's a big continuum these days of very traditional roles and very non-traditional approaches to this. And again, if we start to get into looking, don't have a clue what it means to be a clergy husband. We don't have a clue what it means to be a clergy spouse in a same-sex relationship. Another one, reconsider role. This is one. So again, it came out. So the spouse is the main confidant to the husband. Okay. Clergy actually have more supports than the spouse do, which is a really super interesting finding. And I would definitely recommend that they bear all of that and in isolation. That is not healthy. And so I think clergy couples, the recommendation is they really consider that as they're the only and central support to the clergy. And that clergy really need to diversify that. They need other supports that they go to with the burdens of ministry, not just their spouse, because it becomes again, this enmeshment becomes really overwhelming. And then finally, just again, prioritizing social support. This sounds really nice and easy, except for when you think about the third shift. How the heck do you have time for close friends? And that's something, the priority of that is really important. So those are some of the ones that are part of that new study. So I'm going to stop that and back to you, Richard.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thanks, Margaret. I think that just reinforces all the things that we think we know. And Thad asked one of the questions in the chat just now. Studying clergy spouses is difficult. And his question is, why is that? You want to hit that, Margaret?
Well, it is difficult because, it's incredibly difficult if, as you are like Richard, where you want to get a random sample, which means that it's for statistical significance, that's helpful. There are no lists of these people, even by denominations. It becomes, oh, we'll send it to the clergy, and then the clergy might or may not forward it on to their spouse. So there's very little, because it is an informal role. And so that becomes an interesting piece. So then you rely on what's called a convenience sample, which is good. Again, most qualitative research is having to do that, and it is valuable, but always has an inherent bias, right? Because it's those who are choosing to respond. So that would be it's just really hard to connect with them because we don't actually have any formal connection to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will reiterate that, to try and make the points that we think we know about clergy spouses generalizable across a broader population, you really need a large sample that's randomly selected to try and eliminate the selection bias that you get from these convenience samples. So we have to take everything with a grain of salt. And it's like Paul said, test the spirits, right? I think what he means there is verify things, check it out, read the scriptures, read where the data came from and make sure it's from reliable sources. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation still floating around out there about pastors themselves. Not so much about pastor spouses because that hadn't gained as much traction, but there's just a lot of bad information. So we want to try and promote good information use because there are organizations that are trying to reach the pastor spouses, and we'd like them to be able to use their resources targeted on things that might matter. So I'll get off my soapbox. And one of the questions that came up, or one of the topics that came up, is this issue of calling. And I found that fascinating too, as I was reading through the open-ended responses from our survey. Many of the spouses that responded said they felt this was a calling for them. This was not just a role; it was their calling in life to be the pastor's spouse. But there are others that didn't have that calling. And someone posted in the chat that the Salvation Army requires both to have a calling. And I don't know if other denominations have that or not. I know in many of the predominantly Black and Hispanic populations, the pastor's spouse is frequently called pastor. So there are some expectations depending on the congregation that you're in about the role of the pastor's spouse.
Yeah.
But I am interested in what do we think we know about the pastor's spouse's ability to flourish in that role if they don't feel called to it?
Mm,
I don't remember any comments on that.
yeah. Well, and I think that's where I'm excited. Any of you, if you're out there, you're researchers, again, I think this piece of calling is really crucial to the ministry system, period. And so I think that piece is really important to tease out. And I think there can be different callings, like people who had this calling of like, I have a different vocational calling, but I am called to support my spouse either financially. And so I think this piece of how do we tease out what does it mean to be called, right? So I think a calling to support your spouse in their calling is an okay calling, right? It's different than I am called to be fully involved and work 33 hours a week unpaid. That's different. And what does the context then, right? So if you go, I think part of the challenge, if you're I have my career and I support my spouse, like I release them and bless them to do what they do, but I'm not going to be involved. And you go into context that's thinking, oh, you're running the women's ministry, those cause conflict. So I think, again, clarification is really crucial. And I think it begins like individually with that of what does it look like. And I think for me, I'm excited at an era where there is such diversity. I don't think we all have to be cookie cutter spouses anymore, right? We've got the clergy husband who's got this, we've got the clergy wife who's this. I think it can look very different. We can be traditional, and those should be respected. If somebody is like, I feel called to be a clergy, like a pastor's wife, that's beautiful. I think in this day and age, it's sometimes a little hard for young women, or even a man to acknowledge that. Like, I want to be married to a clergy person and be their partner in that way. So I think there's beauty in all of it, but we need to know more, for sure.
I think we always need to know more. What researchers doesn't ever say.
And more questions, not answers, just more questions.
More questions. Every study leads to more questions.
Yeah.
I am kind of interested in the responses from the group. How many of you think that the pastors really appreciate the burden their spouse carries for them? And I'll preface that by saying it, and I said it in our breakout group. One of the women in the clergy spouse breakout or seminar that we had, I don't know, a couple of meetings ago with the Common Table, she said it's like I have a one-legged stool. If you have a problem and you're a member of a congregation, generally the pastor is someone you can go get counsel from, or you can go to congregation members and close friends and get support from them. But if you're the spouse of a pastor, you don't want to burden your spouse with the issues because it may be their issue. They may be the issue. And you don't really feel safe taking it to members of the congregation because, that reflects badly on how your marriage may be going and you. So how many pastors really appreciate the needs that they may not recognize? I'm just curious from the group. I know Marty's got some comments he could give us, but Thad, you too have probably got some insights there.
What you're teasing out, Richard, is the complexities and the isolation. Yeah, I think and also the other thing I was thinking about is that, so there's this idea of calling, and I don't mean to reduce the sense of calling as a coping mechanism, but I think that it can be helpful and therapeutic, to kind of fall back on when you do feel called. But it feels like to me that in some sense that folks kind of go one way or the other. So they, either feel very called into and will endure, or they just kind of disassociate. They, the spouse just kind of pulls away, has kind of an icy mentality, or just, kind of an arm's length, I'm not going to share much of anything. Anyway, others might have comments, but those are some things that came to mind.
I have an observation about clergy response, which is that I'm developing a theory that there's sort of a switch that flips for people, that clergy are people who are really good at caring for people in need and taking care of people who are struggling, and that they start from the perspective that the people in their household are sort of teammates, not customers. that we're all in this together. And, you know, I come home from church and thank goodness I don't have to pastor you because you're, you know, you're okay. You're part of my team. And I think that there's, my observation is that when a family member shows real vivid, like unmissable distress, the clergy person will, the switch flips and they're like, oh no, you're a person who needs care. I know how to give care. But that the time before that, when you're sort of, the desperation is building up, gets missed. And what I see is that spouses sometimes have stories of getting really great responses from their partners at the moment when they couldn't function, when they stopped being able to hold it up. And their partner said, oh my gosh, let's get you help. Let's get you support. Let's prioritize your wellness. But it's the blind spot in awareness. And it's a blind spot that I think is, I don't know if it's essential, if it's unavoidable, but it's certainly understandable that you use that awareness in the parish all day and then you come home and you kind of turn it off. And so there has to be a real distress call to turn it back on. So one thing I say to spouses is use your words. Say, I am not okay. Say, I am struggling. Don't just like tough it out and wait for someone to notice.
Yeah.
The call has to be really explicit.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think there are definitely, like, when we think about that isolation thing is a really key, the enmeshment, right? Like the messiness of no, very few careers. There may be a few others where, again, the family and spouse are so enmeshed in the other's career is highly unusual. You know, sometimes when I like to get spicy, I say, like, why do spouses and kids have to go to the church? And everyone's like, in my tradition, that's like, you don't suggest that, right? Like, of course they go. And then they get all, well, it's, you know, and they have all these like, well, it's healthy. I was like, oh, well, what if it's not? Like, we know lots of research says it's like, you know, spouse or kids might not be doing well there. And they're like, oh, well, they have to go. Otherwise the husband doesn't look credible. And then I'm like, oh, interesting. My husband doesn't sit in my teaching to make me credible. It's interesting that we think that. And so I think, again, so many of those enmeshed things we're just blind to, right? And they do, you know, again, the whole fact that, you know, again, a spouse or the clergy person might not disclose marital problems because, oh, wait a second, that's our livelihood. We're already struggling financially for a lot of clergy, and I'm going to lose. I might not say anything. There are times where somebody is abusive and they won't say anything because they're going to lose their career. So it's, again, I think the complexities of that are really important. And then the loneliness, right? It's like, I can't go to anyone. Like the protectiveness of one another in those spaces is very, very, very profound. So.
Right. Well, we are coming up on the end of the hour. Thad, do you have any final words you want to say to us? And I think at the end, Margaret, you've got a short advertisement for a course that may be coming up.
Yeah.
Margaret, why don't you go first?
Okay, so I teach a course on clergy well-being. So again, my full-time job is a professor at Briercrest Seminary. Again, I will say it's primarily focused on the clergy person, but we do definitely touch on spouses, family. It is an online, a mix of asynchronous and synchronous, so some live times. It's coming next winter, so it's a long ways away, but my dean at my seminary is lovely. And he knows I love this topic a lot, so he's offered that if I am speaking at events like this, that if people get in touch with me and want to register, a 50% discount off of auditing, and a 33% discount if you wanted to take it for credit. And so again, that's in Canada, so very affordable if you're in the US right now, because the Canadian dollar's not doing so great. So if that was something of interest, my email, basically we don't have an easy like registration system for this. You basically have to email me. Registration doesn't open for this until the summer, but if you're interested, you can shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. You can put it in your calendar, kind of get in touch with me in July. And yeah, if that's of interest.
Fantastic. All right. So just a couple of closing thoughts before we depart. The first is a comment or observation from Esther Kim Young, who is a professor in California. She is a historian and studies kind of the Reformation era. And, you know, it's very interesting to think about the topic of clergy spouses as it's somewhat of a Protestant particularity. And one of the things that she has observed in her research of the Reformation era is that the way that the Protestant reformers discerned whether or not the Protestant Reformation was taking root as it spread across Europe was two things. One, were the poor being cared for? And then secondly, were the families of the pastor being cared for? And I think that's just so incredibly interesting. Like, you know, what if we, as a people of faith, judged the efficacy and effectiveness of our traditions based upon were the poor being cared for and were the families of our religious leaders being cared for? Like that's kind of going to be the baseline judgment. So anyway, just an interesting historical fact that you can use while playing Trivial Pursuit or something. I don't. So anyway, I wanted to just simply thank you all so much for being here today and also announce our next gathering on March 28th at noon, the same time Eastern. We're going to be hearing from Appalachian State's Brooke Harmon and also Healthy Seminarians, Healthy Churches, Karen Webster. They're going to give an interactive gathering on the existing research about women in ministry. And so we do hope that you will be here with us for that. If you have not already, I'll encourage you to register on our website where you can find out more details about that and other gatherings we've got coming up as well. So thank you all so much for being with us today and hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.